The Walpurgis manuscript, Royal Armoury's manuscript I33, involves the coordinated use of a sword and buckler. The sword and buckler was an ancient fighting form and persisted more or less continuously from at least the 13th century into the 19th century. A buckler is a small, center grip shield, usually made from iron, steel, or wood, held in the non-dominant hand, usually left, hand. It has a raised central boss, or dome, and usually a straight metal rod running from rim to rim at the back to act as a handle. The outer surface of the buckler is often angled back at a slight angle towards the holder, making its shape somewhat concave. While the shape of the shield could vary substantially, one of the most common forms is a round buckler of about 12 inches diameter, the design found in the Walpurgis manuscript. Often, there was a spike projecting from the center of the boss. While the function of this spike is often imagined to be a means of striking the opponent with the point, see Degrassi's description of a moustachiо, and no doubt punctures to an opponent's arm, body, and face could occur, it is likely that a primary purpose of the spike was to help resist the tendency of the opponent's sword to slide off of the buckler, giving the buckler holder more control over the opponent's sword. Generally, the modern fencer omits the spike due to its potential to cause unintended harm to fencing partners. The buckler in the Walpurgis manuscript is oddly drawn. It is clearly a circular metal buckler with a central boss bearing a central spike. Examination of the handle in the manuscript's illustrations indicates it has the common straight metal handle going from rim to rim. There are hints in some illustrations that the handle was probably made by folding sheet steel or iron and had a flattened section in the middle to aid grip and resist the tendency of the buckler to rotate in the holder's grip when it was struck. The size of the buckler is open to speculation as it is illustrated in the manuscript in different sizes depending on whether it is displayed in profile or from the front. For some reason, which no one has been able to understand, the buckler is shown much larger in profile in the manuscript. Surprisingly, this can be observed in other contemporary manuscripts. We can deduce that the smaller buckler size, which judging by its size in relation to the fighter's head and body is approximately 12 inches in diameter, is the more appropriate size by looking at the technique used by the priest and his student. Some of the arm crossing characteristic of the manuscript style would be awkward or impractical with a buckler much larger than this. The buckler is held firmly in the fist of the non-dominant hand. It needs to be held firmly enough so that it is not easily displaced when struck, and is unlikely to rotate in the hand. All the illustrations in the manuscript that show the back of the buckler show the handle held vertically. Whether this is artistic convention or a reflection of actual practice is difficult to determine. The swords are depicted somewhat variably in the manuscript illustrations, but nonetheless are consistent with the known 13th or early 14th century single-handed weapon types, usually classified as an oakshot type 12 or similar. They have a broad blade of about 30 to 32 inches in length, which tapers to a point. Typically, such swords had fairly simple cross quillion, which offered base protection to the sword hand. They had a balance point several inches along the blade from the quillion, a design feature common in swords designed for cutting. The sword probably weighed about a kilogram or a little more, judging by museum specimens and modern weapons made to this design. In many ways, the weapon is effective for both cutting and thrusting at the opponent. The Walpurgis style involves gripping the sword handle in what we might call a standard hammer grip. This allows for convenient cutting with a flexible wrist and keeps the hand behind the quillion. If you hold the sword in a death grip, you will find the flexibility of movement you can achieve is greatly reduced. If you hold the sword too lightly, it will fly from your hand when struck. You need to grip the sword firmly, but with what might be called soft hands. The sword handle needs to be able to move a little in your fist, while not so much that it can be easily knocked from your grasp. Space and time. In order to strike your opponent, you need to get close enough to do so. The distance between yourself and your opponent, where you can just effectively cut and thrust at his or her torso or head, is referred to in this manual simply as distance, or being in distance. In the manuscript, the author uses the term enter to describe moving into distance. All fencing begins out of distance, with one or both fencers moving into distance to launch an attack. For this reason, the movement of the feet and the positioning of the body are crucial in the timing and geometry of an attack or defense. The wide stance used in the Walpurgis style, combined with the tendency to stand on the balls of the feet, speak of very rapid movements into and out of distance. Giacomo di Grassi, an Italian fencing master of the 16th century, described the relative time taken by a fencer when moving various parts of his body. He pointed out that movements of the feet, which usually carry us into distance, are intrinsically the slowest. By contrast, movement of the hands, which we often move the sword and buckler to guard ourselves from attack, are the fastest movements. By starting out of distance, we require our opponent to attack knowing that we will, in response, have the time to make defensive movements of the hands before their blow or thrust strikes us. Many of the characteristic features of particular fencing styles are a result of the ways that fencers have developed to overcome this timing and balance. We will consider timing further in Chapter 3. Stance. The Walpurgis technique is to stand with a very wide stance, generally upright when out of distance, and with a pronounced forward lean and a bend at the waist when in distance. The heel of the back foot, and often the front as well, should be off the ground, sometimes significantly off the ground, so you are standing on the balls of your feet, or occasionally on the toes of the front foot. The back foot often points generally forward towards the opponent, similar to the orientation of the front foot. There are a few illustrations showing the back foot at right angles to the front foot, that is, pointing about 90 degrees to the line from the front foot of the opponent. This type of stance facilitates rapid movement. However, it also maximizes your defensive worries, as you are moving your most vulnerable parts of your body, the head and torso, much closer to your opponent. On the other hand, your legs and lower torso, which tend to be behind and below your sword buckler, are kept largely out of reach of your opponent's sword. This type of upright, forward-leaning, wide stance immediately indicates an aggressive, rapidly moving style in which attack on the upper body of the opponent is emphasized. There is a natural tendency for the beginning sword and buckler fencer to concentrate on using either the sword or the buckler. Often they fall into the habit of using the buckler to defend against attack and the sword to attack the opponent. This approach tends to have unfortunate consequences, usually resulting in a quick defeat. The Walpurgis style requires close coordination between the sword and the buckler, and these are usually found pressed together in front of you when you are in distance. When we attack an opponent with a sword, we are usually aiming to thrust or cut at the vital parts of the body, which will bring the fight to a rapid conclusion. This usually means that attacks are directed at the head or central torso. Useful results can also be had by attacking the extremities, arms, and legs when these are exposed. In order to block these cutting or thrusting actions, we have to block the line from the opponent's sword through our midline, including the head. This is particularly important when using the wide stance and forward lean described in the manuscript. Simply putting the buckler in the path of an opponent's sword tends to be ineffective, as the buckler is not usually able to move as rapidly as the sword. However, a combination of sword and buckler held closely together very effectively blocks the center line. This is particularly so if the arms are extended to the maximum degree in front of the body. By putting your sword and buckler as far out in front of you as you can manage, you have created a protective cone in front of your midline much larger than would be the case if the sword and buckler were held much closer to your chest. In general, when you have entered into distance, you will want to have your arms extended to the maximum degree to provide this broad protection and to maximize the reach of your sword. Novice fencers, or fencers with a background in Olympic fencing, often begin by simply extending the sword arm and pointing the sword at their opponent. This has a number of disadvantages. Swords designed for cutting are very effective at not only cutting at the body, but also at an opponent's sword. Extending the sword out more or less in front of you, referred to as langort or long point in the manuscript, makes it very easy for your opponent to strike your sword away forcefully from the center line, exposing your body to an easy counterattack into the opening that has been created. One way to minimize this difficulty is to angle the sword upwards about 45 degrees. This significantly increases the distance your opponent needs to cover in order to strike at your blade, slowing down their attack and making them more vulnerable to counterattack. It also offers useful protection for the head. If you hold the buckler so its face is directly towards your opponent, you can maximize the area you cover. However, this way of positioning the buckler presents other problems. The width of the buckler can get in the way of efficient cutting at your opponent. Strikes or thrusts at the edge of the buckler held flat towards your opponent can also result in the buckler rotating in your hand under the force of the blow or thrust, thereby exposing your center line to attack. Also, your opponent can make a small step to the right and cut or thrust at the forearm behind your buckler very quickly. In order to cover the buckler forearm, it is necessary to hold the buckler at an angle so that the back of the buckler partially covers the buckler forearm. Many of the illustrations in the manuscript show the buckler essentially parallel with the buckler arm. This is likely to be in part a limitation of the drawing technique available to the scribe. Showing the sword or buckler at an angle to the plane of the page seems to be something consistent with the manuscript scribes do not do. This is generally consistent with the 13th and 14th century drawing techniques, where linear perspective of the sort we take for granted in modern works was not used, and didn't seem to become evident in Europe until the Italian Renaissance in the 16th century. The angle of the buckler to the arm is therefore open to some speculation. Experiment suggests that an angle of approximately 45 degrees appears to work well for most situations, though some variability in this angle will occur. The stance that results from these considerations, standing with a wide stance and forward lean with the arms extended in front of the upper torso, with the buckler and sword firmly pressed together in a defensive V and the sword pointing upwards at about 45 degrees, is called Halbschild, or occasionally Halbschild, half shield, in the manuscript. It is an important defensive stance that is often the pivot about which attack and defense occur. From this stance, if you are just in distance, your leg and lower torso are out of range, while your head, arms, and upper torso are protected by the sword and buckler. Your sword is in an appropriate position to execute an effective cutting or thrusting attack, while you are, for the moment at least, well covered. Hits directed at you from your right should be met with the sword. Cuts or thrusts on your left can be met initially with the buckler, though we will see better possibilities later. The manuscript refers to positions like Halbschild that gives us this sort of defensive cover as contraria, or counters. There are a number of such contraria designed to meet a variety of styles of cutting or thrusting attack. We will be discussing these in later chapters. Important notes. When using Halbschild, it is particularly important that the sword and buckler remain firmly together. Separating the two provides a direct and quick line of attack for your opponent at your vital midline. If the attack comes against you from an angle to your right or left, you must move both sword and buckler as a unit to cover the blow by moving your arms, rotating your hips, or rapidly stepping to return to your initial position directly facing your opponent. Your sword arm should never extend beyond the cover of your buckler. If your opponent, in order to reach further with the sword, extends their arm beyond their buckler, then you should aim to cut at the exposed sword arm. A serious cut to the sword arm will take the opponent out of the bout. As you don't have to move close enough to your opponent to cut at their body, a cut to the arm can often be done at greater distance and is therefore a safer option. The rule of the buckler. One of the most fundamental features of the Walpurgis manuscript style is the way the buckler is used. The buckler is positioned between the opponent's sword and your sword forearm in hand. I like to refer to this as the rule of the buckler. If your opponent cuts or thrusts from your left, then the buckler should cover that line on the left, as we saw above in Halbschild. If the opponent attacks from your right, then the buckler is ineffective if held to the left of your sword. The manuscript describes a technique in which the arms are crossed, generally at the wrist, so that the buckler is held on the right of the sword forearm when the attack is expected from the right. This looks awkward, but is surprisingly easy and effective. This movement of the buckler must become reflexive and occur without delay. There are a few guards in which the buckler is on the opposite side to the attacking sword, but in these cases the sword performs the function of protecting the sword and buckler arms. We will meet some of these in Chapter 2. Attacks. Cuts. To simulate an effective cut, you need to make contact with the body of your opponent and slide the edge of the blade along the clothing and skin. Simply powering a forceful blow at the opponent can cause damage and may break bones or disable them, but this is often a slower and less flowing approach, which, if unsuccessful, can expose the attacker to a rapid counterattack. A slicing attack cuts deeply and is likely to disable the opponent without a great deal of force having to be applied. This type of controlled, less vigorous attack allows a speedy recovery if the attack fails, as we have not overcommitted ourselves to the movement. We should note that in the context of modern competitive historical fencing, we do not wish to injure our friends, and this cutting style of attack has the added benefit that it can be done without great potential for causing bruising or injury when using blunt swords and appropriate protective gear. We should note, however, that there is a difference between cutting at your opponent while attempting to slice the edge across their skin and a push or draw cut. The push or draw cut involves placing the sword against the skin and then pushing or pulling the blade against the skin. This cut can produce a local injury and is a useful technique. There are some contexts where the Walpurgis style appears to make use of this type of cutting, in particular when we are too close to effectively swing the sword, such as when wrestling. A limitation of the push or draw cut is that it is slow and significantly less effective. It also demands a much closer approach than we would usually wish to make. It is much more effective to swing a controlled cut at your opponent, but note the technical requirements we mentioned above. That is, aim not to strike powerfully with the edge like chopping wood, but rather to slice like cutting meat. When attacking, it is important that you step just into distance. Too close and your sword and your defensive cover will become less effective. If your step is not far enough, your attack will, of course, fall short, exposing you to a rapid counterattack. One of the major skills that you will need to develop to effectively utilize the Walpurgis style is to be constantly aware of your distance from your opponent and, with effective rapid stepping, to maintain your distance. Once you are in distance, it is important to have both your sword and your buckler far out in front of you, at more or less full extension. This provides you with the maximum range for your sword and the maximum defensive cover. There are several types of stepping that will get you rapidly into distance, so you can effectively cut or thrust. We will discuss these in Chapter 3. For the moment, let us consider a step to be one in which you start with a wide stance and step so that what was your rear leg is now your front leg. Remember to stay up on the balls of your feet and keep your back heel off the ground. The same type of step can be done in reverse so that the front leg becomes a back leg as you draw back. This is quite a quick motion and is a useful one to practice at this stage, though we will see in Chapter 3 that other steps might be more commonly used in this manuscript. This passing step, as one leg passes the other, is a useful one to consider at this stage. Your cut must also be made close to your buckler. A gap between your sword and buckler is an invitation for a counterattack. Swinging your sword wide to the side during an attack usually results in an unsuccessful slow attack, which is easily countered, and often opens your defense for a rapid counterattack. The sword should pass from your starting position on a path which almost touches the extended buckler, which should be out in front of you. As we would expect, cuts are directed at what we can reach from this forward-leaning stance when we are just in distance. If your opponent fails to adequately cover their forearms, this should be the first target. Cuts directed at the upper torso, usually the right or left shoulder, or at the head, are our principal target areas. An ideal cut should apply the edge of the sword to the shoulder or head and draw the blade diagonally across the body, essentially from shoulder or head towards the opposite hip. In the Walpurgis style, a cut should never have the point descend below your waist. Overcutting, usually by using too much force, exposes you to a very easy counterattack. The cut described above is essentially what members of the Lichtenauer school, a highly influential German fencing school in the late 14th century and after, would describe as an Oberhau, a cut from above. In the Lichtenauer technique, designed largely for two-handed swords, cuts from below, Unterhau, were also used. In the Unterhau, the point might start well below the waist, and an upward cut is then directed at the opponent's torso or sword. There is essentially no sign of the use of the Unterhau in the Walpurgis manuscript. The only upward cut mentioned in either the text or illustrations is the Neischen, which I will explain further a little later. As a result of the forward lean and the combined use of the sword and buckler at distance, most cuts illustrated in the Walpurgis manuscript are directed downwards from above at the upper parts of the head, body, or arms. Virtually all the cuts illustrated in the manuscript are with the so-called long edge, called the true edge in some traditions. As you hold the sword in front of you, with the quillion vertical, the long edge of the edge is facing down. If you swing your arm down at a target in a cutting action, it is the long edge of the sword that will strike the target. Some later sword and buckler styles, for example Moroso, use the short or false edge extensively to parry the opponent's sword aside or to cut upwards. Surprisingly, the Walpurgis style makes no use of the short edge in virtually any of its patterns of attack and defense. Thrusts. Another of the characteristics of the Walpurgis style is the emphasis on thrusts. The majority of the successful attacks illustrated in the manuscript end in a lethal thrust, frequently directed at the head. The manuscript states that one of the characteristic features of the priest's fencing style, which singles him out from the ordinary fencer, is his willingness to thrust where the ordinary fencer would cover, or defend. There are two general types of thrust depicted in the manuscript. The first is a simple movement forward and extension of langort, or long point, in which the thrust strikes the head, torso, or the lower abdomen of the opponent. While the movement itself is relatively straightforward, the timing and context of its use is crucial to its success. We must remember that all thrusts, and cuts for that matter, take our sword through langort and offer the possibility that your sword may be moved offline by your opponent. You should, of course, keep the sword and buckler together, covering the midline as you move forward into the thrust. This provides as much cover as possible while extending the sword. We would, obeying the rule of the buckler, move the buckler to the right side of the sword arm as we thrust if the opponent's sword is to your right. The second type of thrust, and possibly the dominant method of thrusting and killing the opponent, is called the sticklack, literally a thrust strike. You will need to be familiar with this thrusting action and frequently practice this distinctive and very effective move. As soon as opponents move into distance and start a downward cut towards us, they create an opening in their defense. The right side of their face is no longer protected by their upward pointing sword blade. By taking a small step towards the opponent and crossing your arms so that the buckler can deflect your opponent's cut or thrust off to your right, you can project a firm, high thrust to the right side of the opponent's head or face. The sword and buckler should be held high at full extension in front of your face with the arm crossed at the wrists, the buckler arm on top. This move needs to be done swiftly and efficiently. You will need to practice it often to master it. If your opponent moves to your right to avoid the point, a simple sideways movement of the wrist of the sword arm can often track their movement so the thrust still strikes them. The stick lock, when performed quickly and unexpectedly, is very effective. If performed slowly or predictably, it is unlikely to succeed and can expose the performer to a variety of counterattacks. The manuscript authors also use stick lock frequently when the opponent fails to move or take appropriate defensive actions. It is a vigorous and powerful move. While the manuscript singles out the stick lock for special attention, we should note that it is simply a high thrust from the left. The rule of the buckler tells us that as you move to the left, your opponent's sword will be on the right, and therefore you need to cross your wrists to move the buckler into a position where it can effectively cover the right side of your sword arm and also to deflect the opponent's sword. In a modern context, we need to be aware that while performing the stick lock, with both fencers moving forward and the thrust pushing out to full extension, the force of the impact on the receiver's head and face can be significant. Make sure you are both wearing appropriate masks or helms with good padding about the face. Keep the elbow on the sword arm ready to flex to reduce impact. Defense. Binds. Cuts can be rapidly directed at an opponent as the fencer enters distance. This potentially powerful, usually downward blow, can be daunting to experience. It is a natural reaction to wish to withdraw your arms and step backwards. While stepping out of distance or pulling your arms back can sometimes have some value, it removes your ability to counterstrike and can reduce your cover, making you easier to hit. If a cutting action descends forcefully towards you, and you don't withdraw, you are likely to try and block the blow with the sword or buckler. You then take the full force of the cut on your sword or buckler. This stopping or blocking action can take considerable effort and can injure you or move your sword or buckler so far offline that you are vulnerable to a further or continued attack. A simple hit on your buckler can also bounce your opponent's sword back, allowing them to attack again quickly on a different and more threatening line. To stop this, you must gain control of your opponent's blade. Instead of simply blocking a cut, a better approach is to deflect the attacker's blow. If the blade is coming downwards at you, it takes relatively little force to push it sideways, at right angles to its path of travel. The manuscript states that there are 4 types of deflections or binds of the opponent's blade, which we can use to move his or her sword away. We can cut at the opponent's sword as it descends towards us, and push it downward to the left or downward to the right. We end with our sword on top of the opponent's sword. We have a clear line to strike at our opponent. This position is described as an overbind. You could strike the sword away to the left or right and up with your sword under the opponent's blade. This is known as an underbind. The manuscript makes the point that the overbind is generally much more effective than the underbind, and is to be recommended in most situations. The fencer with their sword on top is in a position to direct a further cut or thrust at their opponent. The sword's person with the sword underneath has to free their sword before they can attack their opponent. Nonetheless, an underbind can be an effective way of moving a rapid cut or thrust off the line so that it does not strike you and can lead to effective counterattacks. Underbinds can be at various heights by raising or lowering the arms, allowing you to meet high or low attacks. Binds should not just involve a blow of the opponent's sword. We must push the opponent's sword until their point is well offline. If you just strike it at their sword, and then move your sword immediately away, a skilled fencer will use the impact of their blade to rapidly move their sword around so it is again threatening you. You need to maintain your pressure on the opponent's sword through the bind until your buckler can restrict the movement of their sword. The manuscript places great emphasis on the role of binds. Every time our opponent uses langort, that is, he or she extends their blade out in front of them, with the intent to cut or thrust at you, it should be met with a firm cutting action from your sword and pushed into an overbind setting, where possible with your sword on top. Alternatively, use an underbind if the overbind is not possible. If the cut or thrust is coming towards your left side, you are likely to strike the opponent's sword away to the left. Similarly, if the opponent's attack is to the right of your body, the overbind should generally be directed to the right. The manuscript authors state that just as the overbind is superior to the underbind, the right overbind is superior to the left overbind. The direction here, right or left, is from the performer's perspective. Example, a right overbind moves the opponent's blade down, and to the performer's right, the bound person's left. During the overbind to the right, the bound fencer has a problem. Remembering that the fencer is required to have their buckler cover their sword forearm, the bound fencer's buckler and body is in the way of their sword, making it difficult to extricate from the sword from the bind. If your opponent lifts his buckler to allow easy passage of his sword, he has exposed his sword arm, allowing a quick strike at it. A serious cut to the sword arm will normally end a fight. If you overbind your opponent to your left, their sword can more readily move out from the bind as their body and buckler are much less in the way of movement of the sword arm. As a result, the overbind on the left is less stable, and you need to attack your opponent quickly before they can extricate themselves from the bind. Binding is at the core of the Walpurgis style. The authors offer a short Latin verse to aid memory and add emphasis. Dum docetur langort statim liga sub quoque supra. When long point is adopted, at once bind below and above. They add that a bind above will always be more useful than one below. As soon as your opponent extends their blade towards you so that their sword tip is extended noticeably past their buckler in a committed attack, you should attempt to bind it offline with either a bind above to the right, a bind above to the left, a bind below to the right, or below to the left. You need to keep your eye on your opponent's actions, and in particular the movements of their sword. The Schildschlag, shield strike. We mentioned earlier that moving your guard forward by extending your arms combined with your forward lean results in you creating a cone of protection in front of you that is difficult for your opponent to penetrate. The further in front of you, and the closer it is to your opponent, the more effective this blocking action becomes, though it can lead to exposing more of your body behind your defense as you get closer to your opponent. If, after you bind your opponent's sword, you move or lean forward quickly and extend your buckler towards your opponent's buckler, your opponent will discover that the range of movement of their sword is significantly restricted. Any movement forward with their sword will encounter your buckler, or perhaps their own. If you increase this pressure forward to the maximum degree, your buckler will end by hitting or pushing against your opponent's buckler. As your opponent's buckler is in front of their sword arm is effectively trapped behind their buckler until they can escape the Schildschlag. The Schildschlag is a distinctive aspect of the Walpurgis manuscript style of fighting and is designed to control the opponent's movements long enough to enable a cut or thrust. To escape the Schildschlag, your opponent needs to step back and or to the side. Such foot movements are inherently slower than hand movements. As a result, if your opponent does not prevent the Schildschlag, they will lack the time to step out of distance or off the line before you can strike them. Whenever you are in distance, you must make sure you have at least temporary control of your opponent's sword, or you will find you lack the time to step back out of distance before you can be struck. With the relatively short swords used in this style, and the consequent close distances involved in an attack, the action takes place very quickly once you or your opponent step into distance. To cope with this speed, the Walpurgis style emphasizes controlling your opponent's actions when in distance. As a result, the Schildschlag is a very instinctive and important move, and frequently follows the right overbind. The Schildschlag can also be used following an effective right underbind. The Schildschlag is occasionally, but not often, shown in the manuscript following the left binds. The greater movement available to the opponent following a left overbind or left underbind makes the Schildschlag much less effective on the left side. You will frequently find when exploring the Walpurgis style that movements and binds on the right and left are quite different due to the different geometry on the two sides when two right-handed fencers are facing each other. The Nushin. It is a common and very important part of the Walpurgis style to combine an overbind on the right with a Schildschlag. You can take your opponent's sword offline with an overbind, then move forward with your buckler extended as far towards your opponent's buckler as you can reach with your forward lean, hopefully to strike your buckler against their buckler, causing your opponent to be momentarily unable to free their blade or buckler. This provides you with a brief opportunity to rapidly cut upwards towards your opponent's head, with little risk to yourself. The manuscript, somewhat wryly, refers to an upward strike towards the head as a Nushin, which translates literally as nodding. The manuscript adds one more element to this quick and efficient attack. The manuscript's author suggests that as you strike towards your opponent's head, if they lift the buckler to reflexively protect their head from your cut, then they necessarily expose their sword arm, which you can cut instead. The manuscript comments that while an ordinary fencer might move from the bind directly to the Nushin, the priest and his students still use the Schildschlag to cover themselves as they cut. As mentioned previously, virtually all the cuts illustrated in the manuscript are with the so-called long edge. Unlike many later sword and buckler techniques, you will see that the Nushin involves a cut to the head with the long edge forward. The Schildschlag and Nushin are also shown in contemporary manuscript marginalia, and were apparently common and geographically widespread strategies in sword and buckler fencing of this period. Depictions of the Nushin in the illustrations from these sources also show the cut with the long edge forward. It is important to note here that the I33 manuscript illustrations show no examples of a left overbind being followed with a Schildschlag, and then a Nushin to the right side of your opponent's head. While this action is possible, it exposes the performer to serious risk of a counterattack as the constraint on your opponent's sword from the overbind on the left and Schildschlag are very limited. While this action is possible, it can be effective if your opponent is slow or surprised by the move. The manuscript offers other safer suggestions for how to attack from the left overbind, which we will explore in a later chapter. Escaping the overbind, the mutation, and the underbind. The manuscript provides a couple of ways of escaping from an overbind. If your sword is underneath and your opponent is slow in coming forward, it is possible to bring the sword down and around in an anti-clockwise fashion on the left, or clockwise on the right, avoiding the downward pressure of the overbind, and then cut underneath the opponent's buckler or sword arm or thrust at the lower torso. Alternatively, the fencer who is overbound can use the force of the bind to move their sword all the way around quickly so it is now on top of the opponent's sword. In this case, you have moved from an overbound position to an overbind position. It is a procedure known in the manuscript as a mutation. Another means of escaping from being overbound that is mentioned in the manuscript involves a grapple or wrestling move, which we'll examine in a later chapter. You can also turn your overbound position into an underbind. While this move is not mentioned specifically in the text, many examples can be seen in the illustrations as shown by the raised elbow on the sword arm. If your sword has been pushed down with your opponent's sword on top, then you have little strength to resist their downward pressure, and to resist the forward movement of the buckler as they move to the Schildschlag. This is what makes the overbind the preferred option in the manuscript. As soon as you start to feel the pressure of the overbind, you can rotate your wrist by raising your right elbow and turn the sword so that your long edge is now in contact with your opponent's sword. You have moved from a very weak overbound position where you can do little to resist the pressure of your opponent's sword or the movement forward to the Stichschlag, to the underbind, which allows you much greater resistance to your opponent's pressure and forward movement and opens the attacking options that flow from the underbind. While overbound, we can provide very little resistance to the opponent's sword, but with a quick movement to the underbind, you can protect yourself from the Nushin by raising the arms and can push back against the Schildschlag. This movement, being overbound to an underbind, is a common movement in the manuscript. Before entering, Custodia. Most historical fencing manuals begin by introducing guards, that is, positions or stances you take up at the beginning of a bout, often when you are out of distance. The I33 manuscript is no exception. The manuscript recognizes two types of guard. The first type, called Custodia to the manuscript, is taken up out of distance. The manuscript adds that there are 7 core Custodia, an important number in medieval Christian culture. They are starting positions for either attack or defense. The manuscript suggests that these Custodia are intuitively obvious. All men holding a sword in hand, even if they are ignorant of the art of combat, use these 7 guards. 7 centuries later, some of them appear less obvious to us. At this stage, I will give a brief overview of 2 of the 7 core guards, which are relatively intuitive, and discuss these and the other guards in greater detail in the following chapters. The manuscript numbers the 7 core guards. The second Custodia, sometimes called right shoulder, simply has the sword resting with the long edge facing up on your right shoulder. The buckler arm can be fully extended, but this is not crucial until we enter distance. This is indeed a simple, comfortable, and intuitive position. We will discuss some of the complexities in its use in the next chapter. The third Custodia is different only in that the sword is resting on the left shoulder, as the name suggests. This means, of course, that your forearm is across your chest. As I briefly mentioned earlier, the second type of guard is the contraria, or counter. These are essentially defensive positions taken up to oppose the attacks that can flow from the Custodia. The manuscript frequently suggests particular contraria to oppose each of the Custodia. The most common contraria is one we have already met, the Halbschild. We will visit the other suggested contraria in later chapters.